Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the PopPov conference and to the panel on research and its role in shaping policy responses to COVID-19. Thank you for joining our session, and I do hope that the parallel sessions to which you have attended were interesting and you interacted with the participants. So, as you know, the crisis that we are living today is exceptional in so many aspects. Its size, almost everyone is impacted, its depth and the uncertainty around it, its long-lasting socioeconomic effects, and not even mentioning the human toll. So this pandemic reshaped the way we see the world and also the way we see each other. And it came at a time when trust, either interpersonal or in institutions, was falling. So the role of experts was increasingly doubted, especially in countries where we witness mass protests and populist movements. So maybe one of the unexpected consequences of the COVID pandemic was the reinstatement of experts and the significance of taking policy decisions based on reliable data and analysis, although even this is quite variable across countries. It still remains that we witness an exceptional responsiveness both from the research world and from the policymakers in terms of building collaborations, and not only in the field of epidemiology. In social sciences, we also saw rapid development of new data collection methodologies, as well as rapid assessments of well-being, of health infrastructures, of labor markets, of firm survival, etc. And it seemed as if social distancing brought closer together researchers and policymakers, but also researchers amongst themselves, because we did witness a lot of willingness to collaborate, and everyone started sharing best practices, data sets, and their time, especially with the series of webinars increasing every day. Now, this panel aims precisely at understanding how research shaped the policy responses to COVID, what we have learned from the experiences that will be presented by our panelists, and how we can take this further into bridging the eternal gap between research and policy. So what did it make it easier this time? As someone like me who's no longer in the academia, what we often hear is, well, research has a different rhythm, things take longer than what we need for action. And actually what we did see this time was quite different. We saw a quick reaction, we saw everyone trusting each other. So we are very lucky today to have some brilliant panelists who will bring different perspectives. First of all, Catherine Beagle, who is a lead economist with the World Bank Gender Group. She was previously a Human Development Program leader for Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and her research experience includes the study of poverty, labor, economic shocks, and methodological studies on household survey data collection in developing countries. She will be talking to us about her experience in the World Bank in terms of research on COVID and their support to policy decisions. Then we have Maurice Leibrand, who holds the National Research Foundation Chair in Poverty and Inequality Research in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. And he's also the director of the Southern African Labor and Development Research Unit, SALDRU, and also the director of the African Center of Excellence for Inequality Research within the African Research Universities Alliance. This year, he and the SALDRU team have been involved in the research for the presidency and the National Treasury on South Africa's emergency relief package in response to the COVID pandemic, and he will talk to us a little bit about that. And then we have Marcello Neri, who is the director of the FGV Social and the founder of the Center for Social Policies at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. And he has evaluated a number of policies in more than a dozen countries, and also designed and implemented policies at 3 government levels in Brazil. And he will talk to us about the Brazilian experience on that. And then we have, of course, David Lam, who will moderate the Q&A session. So I will leave the floor to Marcelo first. Thank you.
To you.
Now we can hear you, Marcelo.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this panel. I want to congratulate the organizers. I really think this can have a major contribution. I think each of us is submerging respective problems in respective countries. And I think we can gain a lot from this simple exchange. When we just start to talk a little bit, we have this feeling of how much we can learn from each other in a panel like this. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to just show about 3 or 4 slides on the topic of inequality and poverty, in particular the connection of official cash transfers, labor and education policy in Brazil, looking from household surveys. From the perspective of household surveys, we have also a number of data registry sources. I choose the surveys because I think there where it was the main changes, the main effort. And they allowed to see the so-called invisibles, the informal sector, which was very hardly affected by the pandemic. And there was, I believe, in many countries, but in the case of Brazil, which I'm going to talk here about, we had a first challenge of collecting information online, how to adapt the surveys, sample scheme to online sample schemes and selectivity bias associated. There was the creation of new surveys adapted to the COVID-19 questions and issues. And so I think it's a very, also other surveys that were nearly ready, like health surveys or consumer expenditure surveys, they were released partially. I think there is a lot of interesting information, in particular longitudinal information created in this construction of these surveys to measure COVID impacts. So first point, just looking at labor earnings in Brazil, a series. The first point I would like to make is that Brazil was doing quite badly, either in terms of growth and inequality, in the period before the pandemic broke out. So we had like a jump in labor earnings, per capita labor earnings inequality for quite a while. When it was starting to stabilize at a high level, we have this big jump of earnings inequality. According to Anthony Atkinson, a jump of 0.3 in the Gini index is a big jump and is a major change. And we had like a 4 just in the 4-point increase in the Gini coefficient just in the 2 quarters after the pandemic starts. And this builds on a 2-point rise in the years before the pandemic. So, so we have this big rise of inequality, of labor earnings inequality. At this, one effort that we have to make, just as a side note, some of us got involved in how to make these quarterly surveys into monthly, bi-weekly, weekly surveys to try to create ways to adapt the sampling scheme and to have not only faster information, but also more frequent on a monthly basis and so forth. This is shown by this blue line there on a monthly basis. If you look at labor, per capita labor earnings, as I said, Brazil was recovering from a very deep recession. I think perhaps the biggest we ever had in our historical series. And just in the start of the pandemic, in terms of quarters, we saw this big fall of labor earnings, per capita labor earnings, so kinds of synthesizes everything in the labor market. And the first point I would like to raise here is the fact that there are different trends if you use normal earnings or effective earnings. Effective earnings is like cash in hand of people, you know, not how much you should get, but how much you did get. And so it was not a 4.6 fall as in normal earnings in the graph, was a 20% fall of noble earnings fall in just one quarter. So we never seen such a big fall in just one quarter. And when you open the channels in the labor market, which these normal earnings were, or these effective earnings were affected, one point I would like to call attention is first, unemployment as informality didn't rise that much. This is news. Normally we have in the recession, unemployment and informality gets worse. Informality in this case got better. I mean, not got better, got worse, but reduced its size, and it was not good news. A lot of people retreat from the labor market, so participation rates fell. So basically, in Brazil, occupation rates fell about 9.9 points, which is more or less in line with GDP. A point I would like to raise here is that the biggest driver of labor income fall was not occupation, but was working hours, effective working hours. So if we do a simple exercise, and if we didn't have this buffer of working hours reduction, probably caused by social isolation, or from policies like partial and full labor layoffs, the new legislation implemented as a reaction against COVID. If we didn't have this 14% fall of hours, the fall of occupation, instead of being 10%, would be 22%. So the first evidence I would like to point here is the importance of policies that allow to reduce and to working hours. The Brazilian case is as other countries, in extreme in terms of labor inequality and labor level, and as well as the jump we had. But if we look at all income sources, including the emergency benefit, we get a completely different picture. Here you have the Gini, the line of the Gini, with and without this emergency benefit, which is a cash transfers that 1/3 of every Brazilian gets, 67 million people as main beneficiary. I'm not talking about families, but about individuals. They got access to this emergency benefit, which was which was around the same level of mean earnings on average. So it was a huge social cash transfers. And what these cash transfers did was, instead of having the highest labor earnings inequality ever, we get the lowest labor, the lowest total income inequality ever, is an 8% Gini point fall just because of emergency benefit. So it's a huge, huge transfer that creates this paradox. Labor market is like in hell, while people's income and income distribution in Brazil never been so good as during this period of the pandemic. Brazil now is in a boom in terms of sales. Inflation is a bit out of control for many reasons, but one is this huge injection of demand in the system through this emergency benefit. Brazil spends more or less 10% of its GDP the increase of the public debt in this year was about 10%. I didn't see any emerging country spending more than that. Peru and Chile spent something a little less than that. South Africa, the last time I saw, was something like 6 percentage points. The problem in Brazil is that we had already a debt of 90% of GDP. So it was a huge injection of resources in a situation where the fiscal accounts and the fiscal debt was not in a good shape. If you look at poverty, the same thing happened. Poverty fell instantaneously, something like 24% before the levels before the pandemic. Not talking about the adverse labor market effects, also compensating for that. But 24%. The higher class, which you can call a traditional middle class, fell 15%. These people, we didn't target the emergency transfer or even the layoff legislation was not turned towards upper income people. So there was a 15% fall in the share of these people, while there is this rise of these low middle class from both people raising from poverty and people falling from upper income strata. So the case of Brazil is this: you have these sort of two extreme situations. The labor market, which provides the main source of income in normal times, is in a worst situation ever in the series, and the biggest jump also, not only the level, but the movement. While total income, distribution, poverty, inequality, you name it, has been are in a very in a never seen such a good situation. I would like to see other countries, but I think in a sense, Brazil maybe, surprisingly enough, we can say we were quite generous, but I don't know if we were wise in terms of the measures taken, because this emergency benefit will expire in about a month time. There is nothing to be. Now it went down to its half of its initial value, and it will in 31 of December it will go to zero. Looking a little bit about education is something that these surveys allow us to see. In Brazil, we normally have 4 hours of education for each school day. It went down to a half, 2 hours and 18 minutes in the public schools. And one point that worries me a lot is the fact that in the last 40 years, either the level of education and the distribution of education in Brazil has been improving from a very low level, but continuously improving. So it was like the wind was in favor of inequality and poverty. And during this pandemic, we see a rise of education inequality captured by school time. So basically, these deterioration of school time was worse for poorer kids, as opposite what was happening before, to kids which are younger, not a teenager, but younger kids, perhaps feel lack of a full processor, a full tutor that could take care of them, and also in more distant areas. And when you see, for example, Black kids, the reason why they are studying little is because they are just not receiving the material they should be getting. It's twice what white students' reasons for not studying. This lack of supply. And surprisingly enough, if you get young adults from 15 to 29, the matriculation rate of this group has never been ever so high. So it's a situation full of paradoxes. So to end up, just a few notes on the health side. Brazil, although we had this very generous package of economic and social policy, Brazil has 3% of the world population, but around 11% of overall COVID-19 related deaths. So health-wise, we did very badly. And our elderly group, which is the most affected by the pandemic crisis health-wise, they were relatively well off before the pandemic, and we don't have such a big share of the elderly population. We are still in the middle of the demographic transition, and still we're gonna have a reduction in 1 year in life expectancy. Before the crisis, we were rising every 3 years, we would rise 1 year. Now we lost in 1 year what we would win in 3 years. And this effect is not so big because we are talking about mostly people dying at elderly stage. So overall, I think the Brazilian case, both in terms of policies and in terms of data efforts, I think we were quite, as I say, generous. We had a big movement. Up to now, we had weekly surveys that are the size of a month survey in normal times. So very abundant data. And now, from December onwards, we won't have this survey anymore. So in my opinion, my sense is that Brazil did lots of good things. A lot of good things is perhaps not a very good thing in the end if you are not able to keep either the surveys, either the policies. So I must say I'm very concerned about our situation in the 1 month time when this benefit will go to zero. The pandemic is rising, and so I'm very, very worried, and I hope we find our way in this next month or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. So I will leave the floor to Kathleen, who you have around 10 to 12 minutes. And while Kathleen is getting ready, just to remind our participants, you can ask your questions in the Q&A tab that you have just under the screen, and that after the presentations, we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anda. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you all can see my slide there. Yes? Yes, I'll assume that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour from the presentation we just heard and talk a little more generally about the challenges of measuring the impact on households, and particularly from a gender angle in terms of the impact of COVID and how that influences our ability to inform policy design. And this is based on work that colleagues at the World Bank have been doing, but it also echoes other efforts, including colleagues at UN Women who are doing a lot of work in this space also. So let me get going. Okay, so I have too many slides, first of all. Thank you for your patience. I have too many slides. I will not read all of them in detail, but they'll be available later if you want to see them. And some of the content is generic, doesn't need to be read. But of course, we know that COVID-19 impacts are significant and widely felt. We know they vary across groups, and we've just had a great discussion about that in Brazil. And we all believe that data on these impacts will be helpful in informing policy design. The challenge here, of course, is the speed with which we want the data and the circumstances that limit our ability to collect data, in particular lockdowns in some contexts, but also the need to do social distancing and respect the health implications for respondents and interviewers, which has meant a large reliance on phone data collection in a lot of contexts to measure these impacts. And I would also add that even without a pandemic, there's a big push towards thinking more about phone or online surveys in low and middle income countries as a time and cost efficient alternative to our traditional face-to-face surveys. So at the bank, what the World Bank has been doing since starting in April, the bank's been conducting a large number of household and firm surveys. Now, I'm speaking here to the effort to collect data that's nationally representative. And these are efforts that are in majority of cases done in partnership with national statistical agencies, although in some cases the actual data collection is outsourced to a firm because of the need for speed on conducting the surveys. And with all these survey efforts on the bank came a lot of guidance material that's in the public domain. So if we talk about the household surveys on measuring COVID impact, the sampling approaches have been of several different types. And the one I want to really focus on today is the effort to call households that were recently part of a face-to-face survey. So in the case of Ghana, you have the Ghana Living Standards Survey. It was conducted, maybe 2 years ago, I think, 2016, 17, actually. They recorded phone numbers, and the idea is to go back to those surveys and call the phone numbers that were collected as part of the contact information on the questionnaire. But there are two other approaches. One is a registry of phone numbers, not used as frequently in our work for the national survey estimates. And the third option is random digit dialing, which in the context of our LAC questionnaire, Latin America surveys has actually been used. So there you're just dialing random numbers and trying to get a cross-section of people that own phones. When it comes to understanding the gender implications of these surveys, there are some serious challenges to how much we can say about gender from these type of surveys. And in particular, I want to talk about two of them and one in detail. The first, the one I want to focus on in detail, is the challenge of surveys that have been biased towards interviewing only the household head. Not just because they're interviewing only one member, but because of how they're approaching the sample. And I'll speak more to that in a moment. The second challenge is the format of the survey means it needs to be quick and short because it's on the phone based on a number of experiences on what keeps response rates high. And there's also a notion that some information is not well collected on the phone, particularly gender-based violence, GBV. As a consequence, a lot of these surveys, or most of them, are excluding very sensitive questions on gender-based violence where we know we have a shadow pandemic happening. And secondly, these surveys tend not to have a lot of in-depth or time-intensive content, which in this particular case, one would argue would be time use data, which is of particular interest to understanding the gendered impacts because of the different domestic time allocations of men and women. All right, so let's talk more about sample design. We know there are some concerns with phone surveys. We've known this before COVID struck. When it comes to gender differentiated impacts, we know that women are less likely to own phones compared to men. So even reaching a population, if you require owning a phone, you're less likely to reach women. And then when you reach them, there may be differential response rates between men and women to phone surveys. We have less information on that, less hard data on the differential response. But we know from all the household surveys we have, including surveys like Findex, that women are less likely to own a phone. Now, some sample re-rating can potentially adjust for this. But the second problem I really wanted to emphasize is that face-to-face surveys are often only collecting the phone numbers of the household head. And so when we go back to use that survey as the basis of our COVID impact survey, we're only getting household heads. And what we find in a number of the experiences we're having in the bank is what we call an underwhelming share of female respondents and an overwhelming share of household heads. And here we see some results from our Africa surveys on the share of the respondents and the COVID impact of high frequency phone surveys. So why does it matter? Well, we know empirically from pre-COVID data that household heads are more likely to be working than other household members. So if you want to understand COVID impacts, we're starting with a sample that doesn't look like the population. Secondly, female and male headship is not a measure of gender inequality. So we cannot and should not compare responses between female and male heads and say that now we know what the gender response of COVID is, because we know that within households that are male headed, patterns will look different than what the female headed households experience. And the point I really wanted to make here is that reweighting based on household weights, which is what we typically do to address the phone ownership problem, does not fix the age and sex bias of samples that are used to make population estimates. And so what I'm saying here is, if we're using these phone surveys to say something about labor in this particular country, and the sample is biased towards household heads, we know that it's going to give an age and sex bias story of the true labor impact to the population. So how can we get around this problem? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, the sample reweighting won't help. And the reason it won't help is our sample weights are household weights. They're not individual weights. So in most low and middle income countries, the sample weights are household-based weights. Now, an alternative approach would be to randomly select household members to be interviewed. And this is possible in this situation because in a number of countries, in most of our countries, we're doing repeat household phone surveys. So we're not just calling them one time, we're going to call them again and again. And even if the face-to-face survey only collected the household head's phone number, we can, in theory, in a follow-up phone survey, ask for a random adult's phone number to be added to our roster of phone numbers. And we can use that for subsequent interviews. So let's give you a really quick sense of what some of these results look like. I'm going to speak here, sorry, this is preliminary evidence from Vietnam. So as I mentioned, we have household phone surveys happening in over 100 countries, and they're providing evidence not only on population labor impacts, but also household well-being measures like food security. And those measures I'm not speaking to today. I'm focusing more on the labor-related outcomes, the individual level outcomes, and the concerns with the sample design, particularly from a gender perspective. So in the case of the Vietnam survey, the male respondents are largely the household heads, and the female respondents are typically the spouses of the household head. When we look at the impacts of COVID-19, a lot of the findings in Vietnam mirror what we're finding in a number of other countries. So for example, among married couples, mothers as opposed to fathers are more likely to stop or reduce work. We heard yesterday in the plenary about the India results. Again, these findings here in Vietnam are very consistent with the findings in India. Women are more likely to be engaged in service sectors that have been hit differentially from the crisis. Again, consistent with the early ideas around COVID gendered impacts and the results coming out of the surveys that have subsequently taken place. Slightly more women stopped working, and among those women who worked, women are more likely to earn less. Again, consistent with a lot of data from other countries. So looking forward, what can we say about how we can do better to get gender differentiated impacts from these surveys? Well, in our face-to-face surveys and in future phone surveys, let's collect phone numbers of all household members, or at least collect them for a random set of adults in the household. And here I want to emphasize the problem that we're really facing is our traditional face-to-face surveys are heavily biased around the household head concept. And if we move away from that bias, we won't have a problem in future rounds where we're trying to understand population impacts. Secondly, we don't have the scope probably to collect from all household members, but we can randomly select from the roster, but only if we have multiple phone numbers available from the household. Now, a second option in the lower left-hand slide is to collect proxy reporting for all members. This is fairly burdensome, so we'd be asking one person to report on all members. However, in the case of very blunt labor measures, this might work okay in terms of the time to conduct the survey. But at the same time, we are concerned about how well one adult knows the labor details of other members. But again, for very crude measures of labor force participation, the proxy reporting may not be a problem, as we would see where we're asking for more in-depth labor, where we do think proxy reporting is a problem. Okay. And finally, I just want to leave you with a link to a website that we've created that features the findings from both the household and firm surveys that the bank is conducting with our partner countries. It features the gender-specific findings in those surveys. So we're not reflecting all of those findings, again, not the general household food security measures and things like that, but the specific gendered related findings coming out of that work. And we hope that's a resource for many of you. And a lot of the data are being put in the public domain also, so you can hopefully do your own research with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. So we have a technical issue with Marie, who just lost the connection. So what we'll do is maybe just take a few questions while he connects. I know, David, do you want to take the floor for this?
Yes, while we wait for Murray, we had some follow-up questions to start with for Marcelo. First, Marcelo, maybe you could just clarify what are the plans for the emergency aid, which sounds so important. You mentioned at the end that it's only got a month to go. So is it just going to end? And then related question from Marlene Lee, what do you think the impact will that be? Are there any discussions about continuing it or continuing it in some form?
Thank you, David. Very good question. There is no, I mean, the announcement made is that there is no continuation of the emergency benefit. And I don't disagree that the government don't announce that now, because first we have in Brazil like a Christmas bonus. As I said, we were very generous with respect to the transfer, and what I think we should have done was to create an effort for people to save this money. I think like the benefit for people in Bolsa Familia, which are really poor, these transfers were quite well targeted, was like 6 to 7 times the normal benefit they get. So it was very generous. So I see that if you watch that as a grant, say, well, I'm giving you the money, make good use of it in the future. But there is no announcement. There is no announcement. I don't think the lack of announcement is not a problem, but there is institutional things besides the fiscal situation. There is the ceiling of public expenditures. So Brazil at best will increase its Bolsa Familia program, but not a lot, by 10, 15%. So I'm really very, very worried about we are going to go from a very good situation in the picture to a very, very bad. We've never seen both sides of this.
And just a related question from Samuel, are there any other plans for any other structures or any other kind of safety net to take the place of this, or it'll all just fall back to the normal Bolsa Familia?
The problem that we didn't know how to manage a middle path. We have discourse. Okay, we have to have that was the discourse. The fiscal constraint. Brazil needs to fix its fiscal accounts, and then we were the most widely Keynesian country in the region. So it's we are having very difficulty to find a middle path. Something, okay, we have this amount of money, and so Brazil is in this polarization between no money at all or a lot of money in terms of social transfers, and I don't see this easily solved. Of course, maybe when you are close to the abyss, we find a solution, and let's hope for that.
Yeah, great, very interesting. Okay, so it looks like Murray's back. I'll turn things back over to Anda.
Well, just to leave the floor to Murray, we still have 20 minutes. So Murray, if you can present maybe in 10 minutes, it will leave us 10 more minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Perfectly.
Great. Very great privilege to be part of this panel today. I'm going to tell you a story and give you some results. And the story is more focused on the research community in South Africa and its relationship to policy, but also its response to the COVID pandemic in the country. And so where we got to, we ended up running a panel study that's tracking the impacts of COVID. But I think it's an interesting tale with some important lessons. Yeah, but if my screen would change, it would also be nice. Sorry, guys.
Try clicking it maybe again on the presentation itself. Sometimes it's...
Use your mouse instead of the arrow.
Sorry, David.
Click on the slide with your mouse instead of using the arrows. Usually works.
Okay.
And you will need to share again your screen, please. Great, thanks.
Oops. Oh boy. Try one more time. Sorry, guys. It's a great story. Okay, maybe that'll work now.
If not, maybe don't go into full screen mode, and we
yes, that's
will
okay.
be able to see the presentation.
Okay. Okay.
Great.
We should be a go. Are you seeing the next slide?
Yes.
Are you seeing the next slide?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we see it. You can go ahead.
Anta, were you seeing the next slide?
Yes, but I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, yes, we saw, Murray, the
Yes.
slides was working when you didn't.
We can see the next slide. Thank you.
Yeah.
So in March, South Africa implemented a hard lockdown in March of this year. And the government was looking for advice on how to design policies that would then give some sort of emergency relief to those who were going to lose their jobs.
Murray, you need to share your screen
the research community responded in an amazing way. We have good survey data in South Africa, and and myself and a group were responsible for looking at the way our unconditional cash transfers would actually reach to the labor market participants who were going to be losing their jobs. So the sort of cross effect, if you like. And we were using something called the NIDS, National Income Dynamics Survey, which is a panel survey with 5 waves, the last wave of which was in 2017. And we were using the 2017 wave to look at this, and we made a case to government
Murray?
That in particular, the child support grant would actually have quite a good targeting mechanism. If they topped up the grant, it was already in place, that would be an effective way of implementing emergency relief.
Murray,
And
it was you're not showing the
a
slides.
good story and a good response, and somewhat inspiring to the South African community. And that's an initial response using our survey data to help design effectively policy, and government actually, in large measure, did what we proposed. It was effective. It saved them money, etc. So the research community got inspired in general, and I'm not sure whether
Murray, we can't see your
it needed,
slide.
however, a champion.
We cannot see your slides, Murray.
This is the picture of the South African research community in some senses. One of the members of that community, a guy called Nick Spall at the University of Stellenbosch, had an awakening, if you like, that South Africa needed to run a national panel study, put it in place immediately, track people, and do this.
We cannot see the slides.
So
Murray, we can't see the
he then
slides.
convened at very, very short notice this community, including a steering committee with links to government that were supportive of this initiative. And SALDRU, the unit that I work in, is very good at surveys. We were advising on the sampling, and our advice really was approach the National Statistical Office, use their most recent survey, much like Kathleen was talking about, use it as a sampling frame and run the base of that, because you want national representativity. You want to know who you're representing in what you find. If you're going to talk into the policy space, you want to be under control of your survey and who is it talking about. It's a very, very important issue. As it turns out, the National Statistical Office was not able to help. And as a second option, we approached government, which had funded this national income dynamics study, to open up the national income dynamics study again and use the fifth wave as a sampling frame for NIDS CRAM, where CRAM is now the coronavirus mobile survey, rapid mobile survey. Government agreed, gave us back the NIDS survey that they'd funded. It belongs to government. It's not optimal though, because this is the fifth wave of a panel study. And as Kathleen was explaining, you can't recover everything by reweighting. If things are out of whack, you can't do that. Anyway, NIDS CRAM was launched again off the NIDS survey, which had in wave 5 had about 35,000 South Africans. Sampling was done as well as we could. A very intensive exercise to do this. 7,000 individuals were sampled out of the fifth wave of NIDS. It's a telephonic survey. 20 minutes. It's another one of Kathleen type points. You can't do, these telephone surveys are extremely limited in what you can do. There's a real trade-off in trying to push for additional information. You've got 20 minutes, basically, and that's what you've got. So we did as well as we can, but that has huge costs on the quality of the survey, how you measure well-being, what you can really do. So we had questions on the demographics, on migration, because obviously movement is important in COVID, the grant structure, employment, income, hunger, COVID risk perceptions. The survey was designed very quickly in April, basically. Went into the field in May, asking questions about April, and then also asking questions about February. Unlike Ashwini yesterday, we didn't have a survey that was done at the cusp of the epidemic, of the pandemic. The waves are roughly every 6 weeks or so, and second wave is done already. Third wave is finished in the field and being released. The survey data was turned around in incredibly short time. Researchers were working through the night. Data was released to the research community to produce papers. So at each wave, some background papers were produced for government, for everybody really, The data was prepared for public release and released, the wave 1 was released in June. So quite an enterprise with technical reports because of the responsibility that comes with doing this sort of thing. So the research community responded amazingly, had very close support from government, but that doesn't mean you can stop there. You've got to be in control of what you're saying, and you've got to be able to answer questions about the representativity of the data and whether it's usable for policy. That's a burden that we bear. So the first, when we released the first wave of wave 1 of NIDS-CRAM, we had to confront the fact that the NIDS survey in 2017 overestimated employment versus the labor force surveys that we have in South Africa. But we did a lot of work, and at the end of the day, we had to make a judgment call to the policy community, which we've got here at the bottom. Taken as a whole, the general results are supportive of NIDS-CRAM data being valid and not subject to major non-response bias. You can't duck that. You can't talk about your results without actually validating them. Synthesis reports were prepared, and then we policy engagements were held. It's a balance, what you need to do. Government were receptive, but if the evidence had been very bad, well, I don't know how that receptivity would have lasted. As it turned out, we've established a fairly decent working relationship with the policy community. There were no other data, certainly for the first few months of lockdown. So, moving to the findings, to quote Lenin, I presume we're allowed to quote Lenin, there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. That's the pandemic. So what did we see? Just looking at some of the results about the grants, the government implemented a whole range of these emergency relief grants, the most ambitious of which was a social relief of distress grant covering many people who were not getting any of the other emergency relief. So, and the NIDS-CRAM was the only data we had on these grants. And so what does the data show? Coming from the second wave now, the first wave showed that government had been very sluggish at rolling out its emergency response. It wasn't so emergency after all. They weren't very happy with that. But nonetheless, by the second wave, we find on these grants, especially the special COVID grant, that we picked up in the survey that 42 million people had received this special social relief of distress grant. The SASSA, the Social Grants Agency in South Africa, their figures were 43 million. So then we have some confidence in these results. And so the punchline is a decade's worth of grant growth accomplished in 6 months. An astonishing effort. And then NIDS-CRAM can tell you the story of, okay, what's the impact of that? We picked up a huge increase in hunger from February to April, but then a huge decrease in hunger as these grants kicked in from April to June. On the labor market side, a decade's worth of job growth lost in 6 months. The employment numbers plummeted. We saw it in the data, particularly to February, from February to April, where the hard lockdown was in place. The survey revealed all sorts of fascinating and validating things. For example, you can see on the graph on the right, there's this category of furloughed workers. That was a redundant, we never spoke about furloughed workers in South Africa. Those are workers who are employed but not being paid. That was almost a silly category in South Africa. But under lockdown, it becomes super important. And we're picking it up in the survey. And Vimal Ranchard, who's one of our participants today, he did most of this work. And we can track this. And we can track then the fact that the labor market, so there's this huge job growth, job loss, not all of it's recovered to June, to still -2, we're still 2.8 million jobs down in June. The effects are are pretty predictable but worth documenting in the data. You can see people with more professional jobs, they have less job loss by a long way, less furloughing. The vulnerable in the labor market bear the burden of the labor market adjustment, and it's shown in the NIDS-CRAM. So looking forward, here's a huge research issue I'd just like to table in conclusion. The big issue is really whether the COVID shock, a bounce back analogy is the appropriate way to think about this. Is the labor market going to bounce back? Or were the emergency adjustments, was there a rapid response to the fourth industrial revolution? Was it restructured? And so what will the social protection system have to pick up? So the pictures at the bottom really just tell the story. It's the same restaurant in Cape Town, pre-COVID on the left, under the slow release of the lockdown on the right. But maybe that's the labor market. Maybe that's what happens. Maybe some of these jobs don't come back. Maybe there's a big restructuring. NIDS-CRAM is certainly well positioned to tell us that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Murray. I don't know if you can hear us, but I think you can't. So what we'll do it, unfortunately, we couldn't see the nice Cape Town restaurant, but we did have lots of interesting questions and your presentation was amazing. We could follow up very easily. So I will just leave the floor to David for the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent presentation from Murray, and we'll go back to Kathleen. We had some questions from Marcelo already. We have we'll go a little bit over time, but we have another session starting at 45 after the hour, so we will have a hard stop at 1/2 past. But I wanted to get a few questions in for start with Kathleen. Kathleen, there are a few questions about an issue we think a lot about at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research, which is the difference between telephone surveys and face-to-face surveys and what kind of biases they create and so on. You talked a little bit about that. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit more. Also some questions about just kind of remind us sort of the scope of what you're doing, how many countries are being covered, how this relates to other survey activities of the bank, and perhaps you've seen some of the other questions yourself and you can comment on them. So Kathleen.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I think when it comes to the difference between the face-to-face and the phone survey, I think we need to differentiate between the likelihood that somebody answers the phone call from staying on the call once they pick up the phone. And I didn't mention this in my presentation, but and my colleagues don't mention this much, but I do think it's worth noting that we actually learned a lot from the Ebola context, because in the 3 major Ebola countries in West Africa, phone survey efforts were conducted and kind of really got people thinking a lot more about how to do them quickly. In addition to a number of efforts that had been going on for several years in Latin America, as well as in the Africa region on phone surveys. By all accounts, what I've seen is that the response rates where they've been calculated and put out to us, and we haven't had to dig through the data ourselves to get them, are actually pretty good. So in the face-to-face surveys where a phone number has been recorded, there's on the order of, I think, above 90% when a phone is called back. That doesn't eliminate the problem of which phone number are you calling, which household member is being called, the age and sex bias that I mentioned before. And I can say from work I've done myself in Tanzania, where we compared face-to-face with phone surveys over the agricultural season, the data were very consistent on labor measuring. That's one particular context. So I think we need to learn a lot more about how well these phone surveys do. But I'm always pushing for more survey methods work. So that's an obvious answer from me.
Are you doing mainly random digit dialing, or in some countries there are data, you can get data, you know, lists of phone numbers and do random sampling among those?
So as far as I know from the inventory we have so far, the two types of household surveys, what you might call remote household surveys that the bank are doing are either random digit dialing, which is what they've done in the Latin America COVID surveys. So they're literally putting random numbers together and calling. The second is calling the phone number from the last face-to-face survey that was conducted within a year or two. The third option is getting a list of phone numbers. So for example, if we had social registries functioning in a lot of countries, we could use those. We don't have social registries to draw on that are nearly complete and holistic enough. Or if we had, even social security data systems up in place for, or health, universal health coverage data sets of some kind, but we don't have those. So I don't know that's happening. There is a fourth way on the remote surveys I should mention, in addition to the call a number from the face-to-face survey, random digit dialing, the registry of phone numbers, which we tend not to have. The fourth way, which is what UN Women have done in a number of their surveys, is a random digit dialing where you send a text to the phone number and you ask them to go to an internet page and complete an online survey. But that's had very low response rates. I think in the Philippines, my colleagues at UN Women said they blasted something like 2 million phone numbers with a text link, and they got about less than 2,000 surveys completed. So yeah, there are serious concerns with the response patterns and for those type of approaches, the SMS to online survey. Very quickly, World Bank, as I mentioned, over 100 countries. We have the household survey effort often with partner national statistical agencies. We have the firm survey effort, often but not entirely with the national statistical agencies, both of which we're seeing interesting gender differentiated impacts, as well as the more general firm and household impacts. There are, of course, a lot of other types of data collection happening. So to name but a few, colleagues who were doing impact evaluation studies, particularly RCTs, have pivoted to phone surveys in the middle of their RCTs. So they had a baseline last year. Now they're doing a phone survey follow-ups. There are also, a second one I wanted to mention is colleagues who are doing community-driven development projects are calling community leaders to understand what's going on. We have also an effort to call health centers and understand health delivery systems and essential service usage and supply. So what I've spoken to today is just one sliver of the type of data that country teams are trying to collect. I'm not sure if there are other questions I can answer or comments I can make. Let me look through the chat. Let me answer the question. Are the COVID surveys enhancing or detracting from other survey support that the bank had planned? This is a great question. The World Bank is doing a lot more on investments in statistics with NSOs, with National Statistical Offices, but most of them put on hold their face-to-face surveys. So the NSOs themselves were not able to conduct their normal survey operations. And so the type of surveys that I'm mentioning are largely ones that are demand driven from the countries, from the NSOs themselves. Like everything like most all bank investments and most bank research, we try to make it demand driven. So these surveys really are a response to a work program that has greatly been put on hold, a traditional work program that has been put on hold. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Let me turn to Murray. Murray, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. My humblest apologies to all.
That's all right. It was a very good presentation. We just unfortunately didn't get the visuals, but we'll share those with everybody. Couple of questions for you. One, I wanted to go back to the comparisons between what happened in South Africa and what happened in Brazil in terms of financial assistance, which is a little separate from what you were talking about the survey. But you've got a pretty interesting story in South Africa, which your team was very involved in, a lot of academics, I believe. Kind of a similar story of trying to build on the existing social safety net as a way to get aid to people.
Right.
And then we have a question from Marlene about sort of the how this may restructure the labor market going on post-COVID as the deal with some of these structural changes and moving to a more digital economy, et cetera.
Yes, so on the question of the social grants, I thought Marcelo was very interesting and in saying that whilst the response was super impressive, in a sense you can over respond, or he used the language of too generous. I don't think anybody would say that the South African response was too generous. It was quite low and quite incremental, but nonetheless, it was. We have quite a conservative fiscal situation, and it was a real response. And the survey, the fact that the survey picked up evidence that it was having an impact on hunger, etc., was a sign that you can try and design policies without, you can't break the bank because you're going to pay for it later. And that comes back to bear in an issue that somebody else asked in the chat about, okay, but will these emergency policies continue? Well, if you make the case, if you try and do a sustainable, if you try and do an emergency relief policy that really has a big impact, it makes the case for thinking about what you do going forward. And it links to Marlene's question, because if the labor market is restructuring, and it certainly seems to be, you in a country with a very big unemployment problem already, you're now getting that made worse by the fact that the job shedding won't necessarily all come back. And it's the most vulnerable in the labor market. So you do need to be thinking about support. And if your benefits are too high, it's very hard to make the case for a scale up or a reconfiguration or a broadening or whatever. So you need to have an emergency impact that works. But on the sustainability issue, it's very hard if you break the bank. And most developing countries just don't have the fiscal capacity actually to do a lot more than very minimal things. Thanks.
Great. Well, I think we're a bit over time. Anda, if you want to make any final comments or address any issues, I'll turn things back to you.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to Marcelo, Kathleen, and Murray for their great presentations. I think it was very interesting to have very different views on both the impacts of COVID and the responses and how we managed to capture these responses. At the same time, we do know that there's lots of ongoing COVID work, and our colleagues at IUSSP have also been organizing a series of webinars on this. So I think that following the work that is being done, maybe we can think about this in a future conference, and for the next IUSSP conference have a bigger COVID panel. Thank you again, everyone, also for having participated to this plenary, and looking forward to seeing you in well, almost 20 minutes from now for the last spiral sessions of the day, which will be focused on labor, health, adult health, and child health, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.